A few minutes after midnight on June 5, 1968, in the food service pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, a 40-year-old woman in an orange and white dress pushed her way through a wall of shouting men and knelt down on a concrete floor beside her husband. She was 3 months pregnant with their 11th child. There was a rosary in someone's hand, a busboy cradling the dying man's head, and cameras already firing. The woman looked up at the crowd pressing in and said the only thing she would be permitted to say for the rest of her life. "Give him room. Give him room to breathe." The busboy was 17 years old, and his name was Juan Romero, and seconds earlier he had been shaking the senator's hand, which is why he was close enough to catch his head before it hit the concrete. He pressed his own rosary into the senator's palm. Romero would carry that moment for the rest of his life, and for decades he blamed himself, wondering whether, if the senator had not stopped to shake the hand of a Mexican-American busboy, the timing would have been different, whether the bullet would have missed. He visited the grave at Arlington only once, in 2010, more than 40 years later, and he wore a suit to do it, the first suit he had ever owned, because he said he wanted to show respect and to finally ask forgiveness of a man who, he came to understand, would never have wanted him to feel guilt for an act of kindness. A photographer named Bill Epridge, working for Life magazine, raised his camera and took the picture that would become one of the defining images of the American 20th century. The busboy in white, kneeling over the man in the dark suit, the senator's arms flung out on the concrete, almost in the shape of a cross, and somewhere at the edge of that frame, fighting through the panic, was the wife. Epridge had been standing perhaps 15 feet away, and he would say later that he took the photograph through instinct alone, that his mind refused to process what his hands were recording. The shooter, a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan, had emptied a .22 caliber Iver Johnson cadet revolver, 8 shots in a space the size of a kitchen, wounding 5 other people, among them Paul Schrade, a United Auto Workers official and friend of the senator who took a bullet to the forehead and survived, and William Weisel, an ABC News associate director, shot in the abdomen, before the hotel's maitre d', Carl Euchre, got a grip on his arm and slammed his gun hand against a steam table, while the footballer Rosie Greer, a 300-pound defensive tackle for the Los Angeles Rams, and the Olympic decathlete Rafer Johnson, gold medalist in Rome in 1960, wrestled the gun out of his fist. Greer jammed his own thumb behind the trigger to stop it firing again, and when the crowd began screaming to kill the shooter on the spot, it was Greer and Johnson who shielded Sirhan with their own bodies, because they understood, having lived through Dallas, that a dead assassin answers no questions. 3 of those 8 bullets struck Robert Kennedy. 1 passed through his right shoulder, 1 lodged near his spine, and 1 entered behind his right ear at close range and fragmented into the right hemisphere of his brain. Ethel Kennedy knelt in the middle of all of it, whispering to him, and witnesses would later say that for a moment his lips moved and his hand found hers. Some in the room heard him ask whether everyone else was all right. Then his eyes lost focus, and the ambulance men came, and when they lifted him onto the stretcher, he said, according to those closest, "Don't lift me. Don't lift me." And those are generally accounted his last words. Within the hour, America began one of the great public mournings of its century. It mourned the senator. It mourned the brother of the murdered president. It mourned the campaign, the California primary won just hours before, the presidency that would now never happen. He was taken first to Central Receiving Hospital, where a doctor massaged his exposed heart and got it beating, and then to Good Samaritan, where a team led by the neurosurgeon Henry Cuneo operated on his brain for 3 hours and 40 minutes and could not save him because the bullet had fragmented and driven bone splinters deep into the tissue. And when he died at 1:44 in the morning on June 6th, the country simply transferred onto his coffin all the grief it had banked since Dallas. His press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, walked out to the cameras in the hospital parking lot and delivered the announcement in a voice flattened by exhaustion, and the country woke to the news that it had happened again. A second Kennedy, 4 years and 7 months after the first, 9 weeks after Martin Luther King. His body lay at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, while more than 100,000 people filed past, some waiting 7 hours in a line that stretched 25 blocks through Manhattan in June heat. And among those who stood vigil at the coffin in rotating honor guards were men who could agree on almost nothing else, among them the writer Bud Schulberg and the boxer Jose Torres, and half the leadership of both political parties. At the funeral mass on June 8th, his last surviving brother, Ted, 36 years old and now the only one of Joseph Kennedy's 4 sons still alive, stood at the pulpit, his voice breaking on the final words, and asked that Bobby be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. Over the following hours, hundreds of thousands of people, by some estimates as many as 2 million, would stand along railroad tracks between New York and Washington to watch a coffin pass. The country mourned everything that had been taken from it. Nobody mourned the marriage, not the country, not the press, and, in the accounting that matters most, not the family the woman had given herself to. Because a marriage is a private thing, and Ethel Kennedy had not been permitted the private thing since June 17, 1950, the official version of Ethel Kennedy is simple, and it has been repeated at every anniversary and every obituary, including the ones published in October 2024, when she died at 96. The tireless widow, the keeper of the flame, the cheerful matriarch of Hickory Hill, who raised 11 children alone and never once complained, never remarried, never faltered, and lived to 96, carrying her husband's name like a banner. That version is not exactly false, but it is a costume, and the record underneath it tells a different story. This episode is about what the record shows. It will show what the Skakel fortune bought and what it cost on a June morning in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1950. It will show what 11 children and 1 perpetually absent husband actually looked like inside a Virginia farmhouse the family called Hickory Hill. It will show what the Kennedy family asked of Ethel 13 months after her husband bled to death on a pantry floor at a funeral in a small Pennsylvania coal town, and it will show that she did it. It will trace the ledger of her children through the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, because their fates are the most honest evidence of what the dynasty did to the woman it no longer needed. And it will follow her through 56 years of widowhood to a question a camera finally asked her in 2012, and the 4 words she gave in answer. There is also a detail from the funeral train, something she did in those rail cars on June 8, 1968, that almost no one talks about, and it may be the single most revealing act of her life. We will come to it. She was not born a Kennedy. It is worth remembering because nearly everyone has forgotten that she came from money the Kennedys could not match. Ethel Skakel was born on April 11, 1928, in Chicago, the 6th of 7 children of George Skakel, a one-time freight rate clerk on the railroads who had left school after the 8th grade, and who, in 1919, with 2 partners named Rushmore and Fordyce, and a reported starting capital of about $1,000, founded a coal and coke trading company that became the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation. Great Lakes Carbon found its fortune in something almost nobody had wanted: petroleum coke, the black carbon residue left over at the bottom of the refining process when crude oil is cracked into gasoline and kerosene. Refineries had been treating it as waste, paying to have it hauled away. George Skakel understood before almost anyone that this garbage was nearly pure carbon, and that pure carbon, calcined at high temperature, becomes the raw material for the electrodes that aluminum smelters and steel furnaces consume by the ton, because you cannot run an electric arc furnace or a Hall-Heroult aluminum cell without carbon anodes, and every anode burns away in use and must be replaced. He was buying an industry's trash and selling it back to industry as an indispensable input. And when the Second World War sent aluminum production vertical to build aircraft, the Skakel fortune went vertical with it. By the 1940s, Great Lakes Carbon was one of the largest privately held companies in the United States, and the Skakel fortune, precisely because the company never went public and never filed the disclosures a public company must, is difficult to price, but family biographers place it comfortably beyond what Joseph P. Kennedy had accumulated through Wall Street stock pools, Hollywood studio deals, and the liquor import franchises he locked up in anticipation of repeal. The distinction matters because the mythology has always run the other way. Ethel Skakel did not marry up. Financially, she married down. The Skakels moved east to Greenwich, Connecticut, into a 31-room brick mansion called Rambleside on Lake Avenue, with a pool and stables and grounds that ran on for acres, and lived, by most accounts, like a family with no institutional ambitions whatsoever. This is the deepest difference between the two clans, and it explains almost everything that follows. The Kennedys drilled their children for public life. Joe Kennedy ran his dinner table like a seminar, quizzing his sons on current events, assigning them topics, grooming them for offices he had already selected. And it was understood in that house that money was not the point of money, that money was fuel for power, and that every child was an instrument of a multi-generational plan. The Skakels had no plan. They crashed cars, kept guns in the house, and answered to no one. Ethel's brothers, Jim and George Jr. and Rushton, were famous in Greenwich for shooting out streetlights with rifles from moving cars, for driving vehicles across neighbors' lawns, and once reportedly through the front doors of the house itself, for a household in which loaded firearms sat in umbrella stands by the door, the way other households kept walking sticks. Her father, George, was a hard drinker, taciturn, and largely indifferent to society, a man who had made one of America's great fortunes and did not much care whether Greenwich approved of him. Her mother, Anne Brannock Skakel, a large, formidable, ferociously devout Catholic, whom the children called Big Anne, filled the house with visiting priests and religious statuary, funded convents, kept holy water fonts by the doorways, and passed to her daughter the faith that would become the one continuous thread of Ethel's entire life, a Catholicism that was not decorous or social, but total, daily, and unquestioned. Biographers of the family, Jerry Oppenheimer chief among them in his 1994 account, The Other Mrs. Kennedy, describe a household that was wilder, richer, and freer than anything in Hyannisport, a fortune with no plan attached to it, money as pure appetite. Ethel grew up in the middle of it, loud, athletic, devout, and unafraid. A fearless horsewoman who collected riding trophies at shows across Connecticut and Westchester, and would keep horses all her life. A practical joker whose stunts at school became legend. A girl educated by the Convent of the Sacred Heart at Maplehurst in the Bronx, and then Greenwich Academy, who went to Mass not because it was required, but because she wanted to, and who told friends, apparently in earnest, that she had once considered becoming a nun. She met the Kennedys through Jean Kennedy, her roommate at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, the school where Catholic society sent its daughters, and where, not incidentally, Kennedy women had been educated for a generation, Rose Kennedy herself among the alumni. And she met Robert Kennedy on a skiing trip to Mont Tremblant in Quebec in December 1945, when she was 17, a trip Jean had engineered with the frank intention of introducing her brother to her roommate, because matchmaking inside approved Catholic circles was practically a Kennedy family industry. The detail that survives, and it is a strange one, is that Bobby did not choose Ethel first. He dated her older sister Pat for roughly 2 years while Ethel waited. Pat Skakel was quieter, more conventionally elegant, better read, and by the accounts of friends, never fully convinced, never willing to reorganize herself around the Kennedy gravitational field, which may be exactly why it did not take. What Ethel did in those 2 years is the first documented instance of the pattern that would govern her whole life. She campaigned. When John Kennedy, a 29-year-old Navy veteran with a famous name, a thin resume, and a father's fortune behind him, ran for Congress in Massachusetts' 11th District in 1946, in the working-class wards of Charlestown and East Boston and Cambridge, Ethel Skakel, a college freshman with no vote in Massachusetts and no formal connection to the family, went to Boston and stuffed envelopes and rang doorbells for him. She wrote her college thesis on that campaign. Think about what that means. Other Manhattanville girls wrote about literature or theology. Ethel Skakel submitted an academic study of a Kennedy election before she was a Kennedy, before she was even dating one. She made herself useful to the family before the family had accepted her, learned its rhythms, adopted its cause as her own. When Pat drifted away, eventually marrying an Irishman named Luann Cuff and moving to Dublin, and Bobby finally turned to Ethel, she had already converted herself into the most Kennedy person in the room, and there is testimony from family friends that this was precisely what won him. Bobby was the runt of the Kennedy litter in those years, the shy, unathletic, overlooked 7th child, smaller than his brothers, slower to distinguish himself, the one his father worried about, fighting for scraps of paternal attention at a table dominated by Joe Jr.'s promise and Jack's charm. And here was a girl who treated the family religion, the family ambition, and the family itself as self-evidently the most important things in the world, and who treated Bobby specifically as its coming man. Lem Billings, the family's perennial house friend, observed that Ethel gave Bobby a confidence no one else had ever given him. She bet on the runt before anyone else did, and he never forgot it. They married on June 17, 1950, at St. Mary's Church in Greenwich, with John Kennedy standing as best man and delivering a toast, with the church banked in white peonies and a reception for hundreds on the lawn of the Lake Avenue estate. And the wedding was, by the standards of both families, an alliance. Catholic fortune joined to Catholic fortune, the Coke money marrying the whiskey money. What is easy to miss is the direction of the current. Ethel did not bring the Skakel identity into the marriage. She surrendered it at the door. The wildness, the indifference to public opinion, the freedom from anyone's expectations, all of it was checked at St. Mary's like a coat. From 1950 forward, she out-Kennedy'd the Kennedys, by design and, most biographers conclude, by temperament as well. She memorized the family's touch football liturgy, its sailing, its competitive dinners where the unprepared were carved up for sport. She became, in the frequently repeated judgment of family observers, more devoted to the Kennedy Project than several people born into it. More Kennedy than the Kennedys, a phrase that appears in account after account, offered always as praise, and never examined for what it actually describes, which is a person who has replaced herself with an institution. Rose Kennedy came to regard her as the ideal daughter-in-law. Of course she did. The first compression of Ethel's life was not imposed on her by force. It was offered to her as a role, and she took it completely, which is precisely why the family would later find it so easy to keep her in it. A woman who has voluntarily erased herself presents no seam by which anyone can pull the costume off. The children came almost annually. Kathleen on the 4th of July, 1951, named for Bobby's dead sister, killed in a plane crash over France 3 years earlier. Joseph in 1952, named for the patriarch, and for the eldest brother whose bomber had exploded over the English Channel in 1944. Robert Jr. in 1954. David in 1955. Then Courtney, then Michael, then Carrie, then Christopher, then Max, then Douglas, and finally Rory, the 11th, whose birth we will come to, because the circumstances of it belong to the darkest part of this story. 11 children in 18 years, which means Ethel Kennedy was pregnant or nursing for essentially the entire span of her marriage, a biological fact worth sitting with, because it means there was no year of that marriage in which her body was entirely her own. And while the children came, the husband went. Bobby managed Jack's 1952 Senate campaign against Henry Cabot Lodge, a race nobody thought winnable in the year of Eisenhower's landslide, and won it by 70,000 votes, in part by building a campaign organization of unprecedented discipline, and in part by deploying the Kennedy women, Ethel included, at teas across Massachusetts. He served, briefly and regrettably, as a counsel on Joseph McCarthy's subcommittee, a job his father arranged, and a connection the family never fully lived down. And McCarthy, before his fall, was godfather to the Kennedys' first child. Then, from 1957, Bobby became chief counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee under John McClellan of Arkansas, commanding a staff of dozens of investigators, and the nation watched a slight, intense young man interrogate the Teamsters boss, Jimmy Hoffa, in televised hearings that made both of them famous. More than 500 witnesses over 2.5 years, a feud so personal that Hoffa and Kennedy reportedly glared at each other across the hearing room like schoolboys arranging a fight, and once, encountering each other by chance, competed at push-ups. Kennedy wrote a book about it, The Enemy Within, in 1960. Ethel came to the hearings when she could, sitting in the gallery, pregnant, cheering her husband on like it was a sporting event. And, in a sense, for her, it was, because she had been raised on competition and had married into a family that recognized no other mode of being. Then came the 1960 presidential campaign, which Bobby ran with a ruthlessness that became legend. The campaign in which he told squabbling state operatives that he didn't care if they liked him, he cared if Jack won. And then, at 35, the office of Attorney General of the United States, handed to him by his brother, over the objections of nearly everyone, including the New York Times and, initially, Bobby himself. A nomination Jack joked he would announce by opening the front door at 3 a.m. and whispering it. And after that, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the 13 days of which Bobby served as his brother's back channel to the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, and the world came as close to nuclear war as it has ever come. The Freedom Rides, when Bobby sent federal marshals to Montgomery, James Meredith at Ole Miss, when a riot on the campus killed 2 people before Meredith could register. The wiretaps, including, to history's lasting discomfort, the wiretap on Martin Luther King that Kennedy authorized under Hoover's pressure, and the war against organized crime, in which Justice Department prosecutions of mob figures increased by several 100% over the Eisenhower years, from a few dozen indictments to hundreds. The record of those years shows a man at the absolute center of American power, working weekends, traveling constantly, and a wife running what amounted to a small municipality in McLean, Virginia. Hickory Hill, the estate they bought from Jack and Jackie in 1957 for $125,000, after Jackie's stillbirth of a daughter had made the newly decorated nursery unbearable to her, was a white brick Georgian house on nearly 6 acres that had once served as headquarters for the Union General George McClellan during the Civil War, and under Ethel, it became something between a summer camp, a zoo, and a salon. It held 11 children, a rotating and frequently fleeing household staff, because cooks and governesses quit in waves, some lasting only days, one estimate putting the turnover over the years at well past 100 employees, horses, ponies, dogs, including a massive Newfoundland named Brumus, who was banned in spirit from the Justice Department and brought there anyway, and who once, at a Hickory Hill party, disgraced himself against the leg of a seated guest, and, at one point, a sea lion named Sandy, who lived in the swimming pool, ate fish from the children's hands, and eventually escaped and was found in a fountain in downtown Laclane, at which point he was donated to the National Zoo. There were pet snakes, a burrow, chickens, and at various times a menagerie substantial enough that neighbors complained to Fairfax County. There were Hickory Hill seminars, evenings Ethel hosted at which cabinet officers and Supreme Court justices were lectured by historians and philosophers, because Bobby wanted his government educated, and it was Ethel who fed them, seated them, and kept the machinery of the salon running while the men talked. And there were the parties, which entered Washington folklore, most famously the night the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. went into the swimming pool fully clothed, in black tie, along with, by varying accounts, the president's sister and assorted other dignitaries, an event that scandalized and delighted the capital in roughly equal measure and prompted tut-tutting columns about whether the new frontier had any dignity at all. That was the public performance, and Ethel performed it flawlessly. The press adored her. She was the fun Kennedy wife, the touch football wife, the one who did not intimidate like Jackie or wound like the family's sharper tongues, the one who made the dynasty look like a family instead of a machine. What the coverage did not dwell on was arithmetic. A woman with 11 children, a husband home perhaps a night or two a week, a staff that quit in waves because the chaos was unmanageable, discipline outsourced to whichever governess had not yet resigned, and a public role that required her to appear always delighted. The children were raised, in the words of more than one chronicler, by a committee that kept dissolving, in a house where the father was a rumor and the mother was a performance. And the bill for that arrangement would arrive in the next decade, itemized. October 1955 gives us the first look behind the performance. Her parents, George and Anne Skakel, boarded a company plane, a converted B-26 bomber owned by Great Lakes Carbon, a warplane refitted for executive travel, to fly to California on business. And over Union City, Oklahoma, the aircraft exploded in midair and fell out of the sky. There were no survivors. Ethel was 27 and pregnant with David. She learned of it by telephone at Hickory Hill, and those who saw her in the following days describe her going to Mass, holding herself upright, and declining to speak of it. 11 years later, in September 1966, her brother George Jr., who had taken over the company and inherited the family's contempt for caution, flew into a canyon near Riggins, Idaho, on an elk hunting trip in a small chartered plane that crashed against the rock wall, and he too was killed, along with everyone aboard. The following spring, his widow, Pat, hosting a gathering at her home in Greenwich, choked on a piece of meat at her own table and died in front of her children, a death so grotesquely improbable that it reads like a curse even to people who do not believe in curses. And the Skakel children of that branch, orphaned twice in 8 months, spiraled into the disorder that would, a generation later, put Ethel's nephew Michael Skakel on trial for the 1975 murder of 15-year-old Martha Moxley in Greenwich, a conviction handed down in 2002 and vacated years later. 3 catastrophes inside her family of origin in 11 years, 2 of them out of the sky, and the documentary record of Ethel's response is almost perfectly blank. No breakdown appears in the accounts, no withdrawal from public life. She developed, understandably, a lifelong dread of flying, and friends describe her gripping a rosary through every takeoff for the rest of her life, knuckles white, lips moving, but she kept flying because campaigns require it. Contemporaries quoted by her biographers described the same thing again and again. She absorbed it, she went to Mass, and she went back to work being a Kennedy. Her faith taught her that the dead were with God and that grief displayed too long was a form of doubt. And the family she had married into taught her that grief displayed at all was a form of weakness, because Rose Kennedy had buried a son and a daughter and never broken in public. And Joe Kennedy had built a family culture in which Kennedys don't cry was not a figure of speech, but a standing order. Between those two instructions, there was no room left for mourning of any kind. Whether what filled the space was faith or discipline, or a compression so complete she could no longer locate her own grief, no letter survives to tell us, because Ethel Kennedy, unlike nearly every other principal figure of that era, left almost no paper trail of her inner life, no diary, no confessional interviews, no memoir. What we can say is that by 1968, Ethel Kennedy had already buried most of the Skagels, and the family she had left was the one she had married. And there is a further accounting almost nobody makes. In November 1963, when the president was murdered in Dallas, it was Ethel's husband who took the call from J. Edgar Hoover, delivered at the Hickory Hill pool with a flatness witnesses never forgot. Hoover announcing that the president had been shot, as if reporting a routine personnel matter, and never once, in the months after, offering a word of condolence. It was Ethel who stood beside Bobby through the months in which he wandered Hickory Hill, hollowed out by grief, wearing his brother's old clothes, rereading Aeschylus and Camus, losing weight, staring through conversations, months in which friends genuinely feared for him. It was Ethel who watched him climb back through the 1964 Senate race in New York, a state he barely knew, against the incumbent Kenneth Keating, and win it. She had already once rebuilt a Kennedy from the wreckage of an assassination. She knew exactly what the machinery of Kennedy mourning looked like from the inside: the compression, the redirection of grief into campaigning, the conversion of a dead man into a cause. She could not have known she would be its next subject. Then came the campaign. On March 16, 1968, in the same Senate caucus room where his brother had announced 8 years earlier, a symmetry chosen deliberately, Bobby declared for the presidency, late, against a sitting president of his own party, after Eugene McCarthy had already done the hard work of wounding Lyndon Johnson in New Hampshire, which is why McCarthy's young volunteers never forgave him. In the middle of a war that was killing 500 Americans a week and a season of burning cities, 2 weeks later, Lyndon Johnson went on television and withdrew. 2 weeks after that, Martin Luther King was murdered in Memphis, and it was Bobby who broke the news to a black crowd in Indianapolis from the back of a flatbed truck, discarding his prepared remarks, speaking of his own brother's murder in public for the first time, quoting Aeschylus from memory, and Indianapolis, alone among major American cities that night, did not burn. And Ethel, pregnant for the 11th time at 39, campaigned beside him through all of it, through Indiana, which he won on May 7th with 42% against the state's governor and McCarthy, through Nebraska, which he won on May 14th with a majority, through Oregon, which he lost on May 28th, the first election any Kennedy had ever lost in 27 contests, and into California, where everything would be decided. She rode the whistle-stop train across Indiana, the one they called the Wabash Cannonball, laughing with reporters, hugely pregnant, and hiding it under bright coats. She waded into crowds that tore at her husband's cufflinks and shoelaces, crowds so frenzied that he needed men, often the same Rafer Johnson and Rosie Greer who would later disarm his killer, to hold his legs so he wouldn't be pulled from the open car, and once he was pulled out anyway and chipped a tooth on the pavement. And she sat beside him in those cars, pregnant, smiling, holding on. Reporters on that campaign called her his best asset, and Bobby himself introduced her from platforms with visible delight. And the reporters who covered that campaign, men like Jules Whitcover and John J. Lindsay, wrote afterward that the marriage they saw in those 82 days was warmer and more equal than anything the Washington years had shown. Those 82 days are, by nearly every account, the closest the marriage ever came to being a partnership conducted in the same room. On the night of June 4th, he won the California primary by 4.5 points over Eugene McCarthy, 46-42, and won South Dakota the same night. And shortly after midnight, he stood in the embassy ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel, thanked his supporters, teased Ethel from the podium, ended with the words, "And now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there." And then, to avoid the crush of the crowd, was steered through the kitchen pantry, a route changed at the last minute. Ethel was a few steps behind him when Sirhan fired. She was on the floor beside him within seconds, and she stayed there, and when the press of bodies and cameras would not recede, she pleaded with them. And she rode with him in the ambulance, and she was at Good Samaritan through the surgery and the 26 hours of dying, climbing at one point onto the hospital bed to lie beside him amid the machinery, and she was holding his hand, along with his sister Jean and his sister-in-law Jackie, who had flown in from New York, and who understood better than any living person what the next hours held. When he was pronounced dead at 1:44 in the morning on June 6th, at the age of 42. She was 40. Now, the funeral train. On June 8th, after the Mass at St. Patrick's, a 21-car train pulled out of Penn Station to carry the coffin to Washington, a 4-hour run that took more than 8 because an estimated 1 million people, and possibly twice that, stood along the tracks to watch it pass. They stood in backyards and on factory roofs and on station platforms in the June heat. Nuns and Little League teams in uniform, and men holding their hats over their hearts. Boy Scouts saluting. Brides who came from their weddings still in white. 5 men in a boat on the Delaware standing at attention. People holding hand-lettered signs that said, "Goodbye," and "Pray for us," and "So long, Bobby." The photographer Paul Fusco, riding the train for Look magazine, shot nearly 2,000 frames through the window. And those pictures, unpublished for decades, are now understood as one of the great documents of American grief. A portrait not of the famous mourners inside, but of the country standing still outside. In Elizabeth, New Jersey, the crowd spilled onto the adjacent track, and a northbound express called the Admiral plowed into it, killing 2 people, John Curia and Antoinette Severini, whose granddaughter was thrown clear as the train struck. And after that, all northbound traffic was halted. Near Trenton, a teenager named James Marino, climbing a freight car for a better view, touched the overhead power line and was burned nearly to death. The mourning itself was taking casualties. Inside the train were more than 1,000 mourners, politicians, campaign staff, journalists, family, an arc of the entire liberal establishment of 1968, and the coffin rode in the last car, propped on chairs so the crowds could see it through the windows, because Ethel had been told the people outside could not see it lying on the floor. And the detail that survives, confirmed by dozens of passengers, is this. Ethel Kennedy, widowed for 2 days and pregnant with her dead husband's child, walked the length of that train, car by car, for hours, greeting the mourners one by one and comforting them. Her 15-year-old son Joe walked it too, shaking hands, saying, "I'm Joe Kennedy. Thank you for coming," an air being minted in real time, and the passengers understood they were watching a succession ceremony. But look at what the mother was doing. Passengers describe her stopping at seat after seat, asking after people's families, thanking them, steadying them, telling the shattered young campaign workers that it would be all right, remembering names, remembering whose child had been sick, performing an act of hospitality across 21 cars of grief. The journalist Jo Alsop wept when she reached him. Hardened political men who had seen everything said afterward they had never seen anything like it. Consider the direction of that transaction. The widow consoled the guests. She thanked them for their grief, as though the grief were theirs and the hosting duty hers. It is either the most gracious act in the history of American mourning, or the clearest evidence we have that Ethel Kennedy no longer understood herself to be entitled to a private loss. And the two readings are not exclusive, because a person can be genuinely gracious and genuinely erased at the same time, and the second condition can produce the first. 2 days after her husband died in front of her, she was performing the office of hostess at his funeral, because the family flame had to be tended, and there was, as of that morning, no one else to tend it. Joe Kennedy, the patriarch, was mute and paralyzed from his stroke. Jackie had her own dead president. Ted was shattered, and within a year would be broken further. The role fell to the pregnant widow, and she took it the way she had taken every role since 1950, completely. The train reached Washington after dark, hours late, and Robert Kennedy was buried at Arlington by candlelight, mourners passing tapers hand to hand up the hillside, 30 yards from his brother, in the only night burial the cemetery had ever conducted, and the flag from the coffin was folded and placed in the hands of the woman who had spent the day comforting everyone else. 6 months later, on December 12, 1968, at Georgetown University Hospital, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Rory Elizabeth Catherine. Ted Kennedy stood in for his dead brother at the hospital, pacing the waiting room as the brother would have. The child's father had been dead 189 days. Rory Kennedy would grow up to become a documentary filmmaker, and in 2012, she would turn her camera on her mother, and we will come to what the camera found. And then, 13 months after the pantry floor, the dynasty presented its bill. On the night of July 18, 1969, Senator Ted Kennedy left a cookout on Chappaquiddick Island off Martha's Vineyard, a party held for the Boiler Room Girls, the 6 young women who had run the delegate tracking operation at the heart of Bobby's campaign. A reunion, in other words, of Bobby's people, gathered in Bobby's memory, and drove a black Oldsmobile Delmont 88 off the narrow, railless Dyke Bridge into the tidal water of Pucha Pond. Kennedy escaped the submerged car. His passenger, a 28-year-old named Mary Jo Kopechne, did not. He did not report the accident for roughly 10 hours, hours he spent, by his own later account, swimming the 500-foot channel back to Edgartown and returning to his hotel, where he spoke to the desk clerk about the time and complained about noise from a party. And when a diver named John Farrar finally brought Mary Jo Kopechne's body out of the car the next morning, the diver's professional judgment, offered ever after, was that she had survived for some time in an air pocket in the footwell and could have been saved had the call come within the hour. Mary Jo Kopechne had worked for Robert Kennedy. She had sat up all night at Hickory Hill typing drafts of his speeches, including, by some accounts, his landmark speech on Vietnam. She had been one of the campaign's most devoted staffers, so devastated by the assassination that she had told friends she could not bear to return to Capitol Hill, one of the young women who had grieved him hardest, precisely the kind of young woman Ethel had comforted, seat by seat, on the funeral train. 4 days later, at St. Vincent's Church in Plymouth, Pennsylvania, a coal town in the Wyoming Valley the Kopechnes came from, before a crowd of hundreds and a press corps of hundreds more, the family buried her on a hillside in Larksville, and the Kennedy family needed to project unity around the last surviving brother, whose presidential prospects were bleeding out by the hour. And so the cameras recorded Ted Kennedy arriving in a neck brace of disputed medical necessity, a brace his own doctors had not insisted upon, and which he did not wear again, flanked by his pregnant wife Joan, who would suffer a miscarriage within weeks, and beside them, 1 year a widow, Ethel Kennedy. She went. She stood where the family needed her to stand, lending the grieving widow credibility of the Kennedy name to the man whose negligence had drowned her dead husband's aid. And the wire photographs of that morning did exactly the work they were deployed to do, framing Chappaquiddick not as a scandal with a dead girl at the bottom of it, but as one more sorrow visited upon a suffering family. 3 days later, Ted pleaded guilty in an Edgartown courtroom to leaving the scene of an accident and received a 2-month suspended sentence from a judge who declared he had already been punished far beyond anything the court could impose. And that night, he delivered a televised address drafted by the family's speechwriters, Ted Sorensen among them, the men who had written for Jack, invoking the possibility of a curse upon the Kennedys and asking the voters of Massachusetts whether he should resign. They said no, and the family survived. Whatever Ethel privately felt about burying her dead husband's young aide while shoring up the man whose career had produced the burial, she did not say, then or ever, and her silence on Chappaquiddick held for 55 years, unbroken to her grave. The part that didn't make the official account is that this became the template for the rest of her life. The dynasty had lost its candidate, but it had not lost its widow. And a widow, properly deployed, is a political asset that never stops appreciating, because a widow cannot be attacked, cannot be cross-examined, and confers grief-soaked legitimacy on whatever she stands next to. Ethel appeared where appearance was required. She campaigned for Ted in his doomed 1980 run against Jimmy Carter, standing on stages in Iowa and New Hampshire for the man from the neck brace photographs. She anchored the commemorations, the foundations, the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial and its Human Rights Awards, the anniversaries, the endorsements, decade after decade, lending the name to candidate after candidate, Obama among them in 2008, when her endorsement was treated as a laying on of hands. What she was not given, by any account in the record, was the thing widows are ordinarily given, which is the right to put the roll down. The cost was paid at Hickory Hill, and it was paid by the children. This is not speculation. It is a public ledger, and it can be read in court records and coroner's reports. After June 1968, the house in McLean held a 40-year-old pregnant widow and 10 children between 1 and 16, and the discipline that had always been outsourced now collapsed entirely. Accounts from the 1970s describe a household veering between rigid, sudden punishments and total absence of supervision, staff still quitting in waves, the older boys running feral through McLean, neighbors calling the police, and a mother who responded to each new catastrophe the only way her formation allowed, by not speaking of it, by going to Mass, by keeping the performance intact. Grief counseling was never seriously entertained. Therapy was, in that family culture, an admission against interest. The children were told, in effect, to be Kennedys about it, and they were children, and they could not be. Begin with August 13th, 1973, on Nantucket, when her eldest son, Joseph, then 20, swerved a Jeep to avoid another vehicle and rolled it, throwing his passengers. One of them, a young woman named Pam Kelly, was paralyzed from the chest down for the rest of her life, and she would live another 47 years in that chair, receiving from the family a settlement that her own accounts described as barely adequate, before dying in 2020. Joe was convicted of negligent driving, and the judge, fining him $100, told him from the bench that he had a great father and a great mother, and should use his illustrious name as an asset instead of an excuse, a sentence that manages to contain the entire pathology in a single breath, a court of law informing a defendant that his surname was the operative fact of his case. $100 for a spine. Also in that Jeep was his younger brother David, whose back was injured in the crash, and who was prescribed painkillers in the hospital, and who found in them something he had been looking for since he was 12 years old. Because David Kennedy's story begins earlier, on the night of June 4th, 1968, in a hotel room at the Ambassador, where the 12-year-old, having nearly drowned in the Pacific surf at Malibu that afternoon and been pulled out by his father's own hands, was left in front of a television, while the adults went down to the ballroom, and where he watched, live and alone, as the man who had saved his life that morning was shot through the head. No one came up for a long time. No one, by his own adult account and by the family's, ever sat the boy down and talked to him about what he had seen, then or afterward, because talking about it was not what the family did. He was sent back to school. The mourning machine rolled forward, the funeral train, the candlelight burial, the flame tending, and inside it, a 12-year-old carried the event alone, and the painkillers he met at 17 after the Nantucket crash were the first thing that ever made the carrying stop. The rest of David's ledger runs on rails from there. Heroin by his early 20s, arrests, a mugging in a Harlem hotel known for drug traffic that put the family's private catastrophe into the New York papers in 1979. Sanatoriums and treatment programs entered and left, and on April 25, 1984, a maid at the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach found him dead on the floor between the beds, 28 years old, killed by a combination of cocaine, Demerol, and Mellaril, while his mother was staying with the family matriarch a few miles away. And the ledger did not close with David. On December 31, 1997, her sixth child, Michael, the one whose name had been in the papers that year for all the wrong reasons, played football on skis down a slope in Aspen, no helmet, throwing a ball among the family the way they had been taught on the lawns of Hyannisport, and struck a tree and died in the snow at 39 while his siblings performed CPR and sang to him. 2 of her 11 children, dead before her, both in ways that read less like accident than like the family style itself, the compulsory fearlessness, the allergy to caution, arriving at its logical terminus. And Ethel buried them the way she had buried everyone, upright, dry-eyed in public, at Mass. She lived another quarter century past Michael, 56 years past the pantry floor, and she never remarried, never wrote the memoir publishers begged for, never gave the sit-down interview that would have commanded any network's prime time. She turned Hickory Hill over at last, selling it in 2009 for a fraction of its asking price, and moved to the Cape, to the compound, closer to the family that was the only self she had kept. The Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization she built became her public work, and in 2014, Barack Obama hung the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck, and the citation praised, of course, her strength. And then, in 2012, came the one unguarded document we have. Her youngest child, Rory, the daughter born 189 days after her father died, made a documentary called Ethel, and persuaded her mother to sit for it, on the theory, which proved correct, that Ethel could refuse anything except a request from her children. For most of the film, Ethel is exactly the costume, funny, brisk, deflecting, narrating 70 years of American history as a series of amusing anecdotes about seasickness and touch football. And then Rory asks her, from behind the camera, about the months after June 1968, about how she carried it, about what was inside. And her mother, 99% of a century's discipline, holding her face perfectly still, said 4 words. Talk about something else. Not, I can't discuss it. Not, it was God's will. Talk about something else. The imperative a hostess uses, the deflection of a woman who had spent 44 years at that point, redirecting every conversation away from the one subject that was actually hers. Her own daughter, in her own film, asking the question the whole world had wanted to ask. And the answer was the funeral train answer, the Chappaquiddick answer. The answer of a woman who had walked 21 cars comforting other people 2 days after her husband died in her hands. Somewhere between June 17, 1950 and June 5, 1968, Ethel Kennedy had converted herself so completely into the keeper of other people's grief that her own became unpronounceable, and the family and the country, which had found that conversion endlessly useful, never once asked her to convert back. She died on October 10, 2024, at 96 after a stroke, surrounded by the enormous family she had built, and the obituaries all reached for the same words: tireless, devoted, indomitable, keeper of the flame. And every one of those words is true, and every one of them is also the bars of the cage and the woman inside it. The loud, fearless Greenwich girl who once shot down ski slopes and collected riding trophies and considered the convent had not been heard from, by her own choice and everyone else's, since a June morning at St. Mary's Church 74 years before. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and like this video so more people can find it. And tell us in the comments whose story you think we should tell next.